as I was discussing about the evaluation of the training programs, and then I was talking about the models, different models are there. Now I will continue with the next concept in the evaluation, and that is about the return on investment. Now return on investment refers to comparing the training's monetary benefits with the cost of the training. So we have to see that is the whatever investment is made. Now there are basically the 6 investments we are making in the training program. One is the manpower, that is the trainer, and the organization is also providing the trainees. So therefore definitely that manpower, the time of that manpower, that is becoming very crucial. So first and foremost is the man is there, then machinery is there, the technology which we are using for the conducting this training programs, the cost of the technology. The simple example is of the LCD projectors. So when we are talking about the LCD projectors, then the cost of the using that LCD projector, that becomes the very important is there. Then we are using the study material also. Now it is very interesting, that is the how trainer decides their honorarium, and then what factors they consider in their cost. So the actually there are tangible and intangible. So when we are talking about the study material, in the study material intangible cost, that becomes very important. Whatever the knowledge sharing, because there can be like this example is there, like there are certain contents are there. With the contents the trainer shares his experiences, he talks about the different case studies, he talks about the different incidences, he talks about the different events. So whenever this type of the issues are there, then what is the cost for that knowledge? Like in the patent we talk about the TK, traditional knowledge, and then that particular type of the knowledge which the trainer shares in addition to whatever he is sharing from the literature, that becomes very important is there. So therefore that is the trainer's cost, the study material cost, machinery and equipments cost, then the method. Now you see I have discussed with you the number of the training methods are there. So therefore case studies, business games, exercises, then the group activities are there. Then there are the different panel discussions, then the group discussions, then the brainstorming sessions, the solutions to the how to generate the solutions to the problem. This becomes very important issue. So for this, once a person learns the approach, learns the analytical approach, and that cost, right. So therefore that becomes very important, because normally it is not that measurable, the experience of the person, not in terms of the years, but what experience he has got, that is not measurable, and therefore in that case we have to understand that is the what cost we are incorporating in that particular the input cost. So that becomes very important. So main, machine, material, method, and the money. So whatever the infrastructure investment is there, so what money has been invested in that, then whatever the indirect costs is there, that is also to be considered, whatever the overhead cost is there, that is also has to be considered during the training program. And then many costs, as I mentioned, intangible costs are there, then they are not measurable. Then the minutes, last is minutes, man, machine, material, money, method, and minutes. Minutes means time. So somebody is sharing his 8 hours, somebody is sharing about the 6 hours. Now there may be the different trainers. So sharing of 8 hours and 10 hours with the trainees, what should be the cost? So, therefore, in that case you will find that is the measurement of the cost is itself in the training program is very difficult, because it is the knowledge based activity, and for a particular knowledge what problem will be solved and then what will be its efficiency and effectiveness on productivity, that is very difficult to measure. However, we will be discussing about in the normal ways, that is how we are talking about the return on investment. So, direct training costs are include the salaries and the benefits for all employees involved in training, including employees who design the program. It is a very important of design thinking, and therefore, in that case the design thinking that we have to also consider. I will take the certain sessions as certain input on the design thinking, that is the how we have to go for the designing the program and for the designing the thinking and the program, that material how, because the like for example the leadership. Now, in the leadership there are number of training programs are conducted by the different trainers, but how the training program on leadership is to be designed. Like I think that is the designing the training program on the research based. That was my very important I feel a topic which talks about, that is the how we can incorporate the research methodology in during training program and can take out further this the findings of this training program into the publications, research publications. So, if this type of the considerations are there, then we have to understand that is the whole crux, the important is on the designing the program. Then what is the equipments or classrooms are there, like the infrastructure we are talking, as I mentioned, that is what are the rentals are there or the cost is there, and the travel, another important cost is, that is the travel cost. So, when we are talking about the direct training cost, so we are talking about the salaries and benefits for all the employees, designing the program material and supplies, equipment or classroom rentals are the purchases, and travel costs is there. When we talk about the indirect cost, it includes expenditure which having the staff salaries not directly billed to the one program. Now, definitely there will be an office, and in the office there will be the number of employees in addition to the trainer. So, these will be the staff employees, they will be supporting to the trainer for the all these is preparation of his study material, and then that will also incorporate the cost, and therefore, that has to be, that is the one program, the it is not for the one program. We can see monthly how many programs are conducted. On basis of that we can go for this particular training programs. So, therefore, in that case it becomes very important, that is the how one can go for this particular classification of the staff's salary in the number of programs. What are the different number of programs are there, and in those number of programs how you are dividing the cost, and then if the number of programs are more, naturally the cost will go down. But if the number of training programs by the organization is not creating the equilibrium, right, so then definitely that will be a problem. Now, I will talk about the indirect cost includes this is built to the one program. Benefits are the value that the company gains from the training program. Now, here is my submission, that is the whenever we are talking about that the company gains from the training program these benefits, then we have to understand how we can derive more and more intangible benefits. So, this particular knowledge capturing, creation of knowledge, storage of knowledge and distribution of knowledge, the maximum cost is for the creation of knowledge, because whatever you measure it is totally intangible, that is the what level of knowledge and then how much benefit is provided. So, these benefits, the values that the company gains from this particular training program, that becomes a very important. So, here when we talk about that the company gains from the training program the benefits and determining the value for that particular training program, that what will be the value for that training program. So, this direct and indirect cost, direct cost is okay, fine, you can measure it, but when you are talking about the indirect cost, then we have to be very careful. And when we talk about the principle of equilibrium, so when we talk about this particular incidence, that is the how we are going for this program, in this case particular training program, we have to find out that is the whether we are going for this particular understanding. For example, I was talking about this particular equilibrium, and in the equilibrium we will go, that is the how we can go for this this one for this understanding. I was talking about the equilibrium, that if you want to create an equilibrium, that is the suppose we are going for the considering, that is the what will be the content level and what will be the pay. So, this knowledge and then this equilibrium. So, therefore, in that case you can easily understand, that is the it will be equilibrium will be low knowledge, low pay, then moderate knowledge and moderate pay, right, and the high knowledge and the high pay. Now, this particular equilibrium which we create in the training program, now here the organizations are required to understand the content, the study material, and then they have to justify on the basis of what benefits they are going to derive. So, it is not the question that is the how much time is spent, but what time is spent and what solutions are provided, that is becoming the more important. Always organizations, when they are talking about the return on investment, they should focus on, that is the they have to go by the principle of equilibrium, and in the content, if the high content, very high content is there and the low pay is here, then in that case it will be becoming the underpayment, because the contents are high but the payment is low. So, then this is not advisable. So, therefore, this is to be considered, right, that is the high. If the content is low, right, and the payment is high, then in that case you have to go for this here you will find that is the content is low and the payment is high. So, then in that case what is it? That is the overpaid. So, please understand that is that during when we are talking about the cost and return on investment of the cost of the training program, we have not to go to the very underpayment. No, this is the underpayment. There is contents are high but the payment is low. So, this is the underpayment. This is the overpayment, that is also not advisable. So, advisable is that is the creation of the balance between the whatever the contents are there and whatever the payment is there, and that equilibrium, that is to be considered. So, this is about when we talk about this particular program, then the return on investment, the benefits, the values of the benefits that the company gains from the training program, that is becoming very important. If you remember, in earlier module I have talked about basically the 4 parameters. One was the reaction, other was the learning, third was the behavior, and fourth was the results. In this particular figure you will find that I am talking about the 5 parameters. The one more parameter is the level is included here, and that is the affective is there. So, in reactions, the level 1, right, because when you start the immediately the reaction comes, and reaction comes about the trainer, reaction comes about the study material. So, learner satisfaction, that becomes very important. So, what a learner wants? The learner wants, that is the what is the goal and objective of an individual that has to be matched with that particular organizational goals or the training program, and trainees goal and objective has to be matched with the contents of the training program. So, therefore, that is becoming the learner satisfaction. Here example has been given, comfortable training room. Very simple example is comfortable training room is provided, and therefore, they are comfortable and an amicable environment is there, so that they can learn very smoothly. Useful materials, whatever the material is there, that is relevant to the whatever the goal or objective of the training program is there, and whatever the contents are there, they are matching with the objectives and goals of the training program. If the trainer is experienced, then definitely he will be able to manage these examples. Otherwise, we can go by the surveys, we can find out, like what we do, we visit to the different places and we find out that is the how was the training room, what facilities are provided in the training room, what is the infrastructure which has been provided, so that the trainees, simple example is the sitting arrangement, whether the sitting arrangement is proper or not. Normally we prefer the flexible sitting arrangement during the training program, because we use the syndicate method. Syndicate method means group discussion, case studies discussions. So, therefore, first they have to go through individually, then they have to form a group, they have to select one representative from the group, and then they that representative comes for the presentation, which I have already demonstrated in the training program of the case study. So, if that is a system, then the sitting arrangement, comfortable room, so that can be arranged. So, with the surveys we find that is during the training program it should not be the fixed furniture, there should be the furniture which is flexible. Second important point is, many trainers they start the training program with the micro lab. Micro lab, they start with the micro lab. What they do, they ask the trainees, that is the trainer will stand in the center and the rest of the trainees are surrounding to him, and for example he will say that is the fire in the mountain, run, and like this, and then they talk to each other, they talk about the strength and weaknesses. So, micro lab is to be conducted, and then if you do the survey, you find that is many trainers are using the micro labs. Then interviews, that is the you see talk to the experienced trainers and ask them, that is how do you conduct. So, different pedagogy that you come to know, like I have taken one session on the digital pedagogy. So, the digital pedagogy, that is also from the we understand that yes, that is to be planned accordingly. Second outcome criteria is learning or cognitive, level 2, that is the principles, facts, techniques, procedures or processes the learnings have acquired. So, principles of learning is there. So, there can be the group learning, there can be the individual learning, and therefore, that for particular facts and techniques procedures that can be used, that is how to make the group learning is to be done. So, this will be the part the learners have to acquire. Examples are electrical principles, safety rules, steps in interviewing, all these will be the type of the training which will be the cognitive learning will be there. So, when we talk about the how to be interviewed, right, and how to be answered in the particular questions. So, then that will be the example, that is the how the training program is to be conducted. Then the what is that, that is a test is there, method of measurement, how do we measure, that is this cognitive learning has taken a place or not, that is a test work and samples. You ask somebody what you have learned, the person talks about that what he is learning, sample technique that can be also you can use. Third is behavior and skills, 2 or 3 level. So, therefore, in the behavior and skills are the technical or the motor skills or behavior acquired by the learners. Very good example can be given, that is about the stress management. Whether the person is having that particular behavior, the learner has learned about the managing the stress or not. And to manage the stress, suppose the solution is given, the time management. That is, the stress is because of the trainee is unable to manage his time. So, the trainer has to give the input, that is the whether it is urgent and important, urgent and not important, not urgent and important, not urgent and not important. So, he has to classify his tasks and understand that is the where he can put that particular task, and then decide that is the which task is to be performed. So, this preparing a desert sawing wood and the landing and the airplane landing an airplane, and then this type of there is also exercise I will share, that is the how, that is when your plane is landing into a desert, and then how you have to take the decisions on that particular situation. So, during exercise that will also I will talk about this particular exercise, that is a landing in the desert and how to then come out from that desert. So, method of measurements can be whether the person's change in behavior or skills or not, tests, observations, self, peer, customers and managers ratings and work samples. So, these will be the methods that will be the measurement for the behavior and the skills. Third will be the affective. Affective is that is the second or third level. Second and third level it talks about, that is the learner's attitude, how the learner's attitude is there, and motivation. So, learner's attitude and motivation, that will be talk about, motivate a person. For the motivation, like when we talk about it we have to understand the need theories. So, whether suppose we are talking about the Maslow's theories, Herberg's theories, and we are talking about that is the how in the hierarchy the need depends or it does not depend, and then identify your goal, identify your need. That is, it should not be only the life for the professional life, we have to consider the holistic, otherwise there will be the vacuum after retirement. So, therefore, we have to understand what motivates me. If my career motivates me, fine, that is very good, but what after the retirement, what will motivate you, otherwise there will be a big vacuum and then the people will under stress. So, the motivation is to be holistic goal, willingness is to be holistic goal. So, that is to be taught, that is to be learned by the trainees, and then for this purpose in affectives attitude and the motivation, this is the tolerance, that is the how to develop the tolerance for the diversity, because you every person is not same, right. So, they are different individuals. So, in that case you will find there are different individuals, different personalities, and if they are different personalities, then that we have to understand, we have to work with them, we have to have a tolerance with them working, because they are having a different thought process, their behavior, their actions, right. So, therefore, that we have to take care, that is the in affective, whether they are able to learn this particular affective component. Then there can be the safety attitudes are there. So, many people they are highly concerned with the safety, it is a mindset. So, some people are they are very less concerned with the safety, some people are very highly concerned about the safety. So, that is another example is there. Third example here given is customer service orientation, whether the person is having the customer service orientation or not. I have talked about the servant leadership, and when we talk about the servant leadership, it becomes very important, that is we are capable to do the serve to others. Our mindset is that is we are not doing the only job for my bread and butter, but I am doing the job. So, by doing job I am serving others. So, therefore, this service orientation is important. Here example is given customer service orientation. I talk about the overall servant leadership is there, and you can think it can be the value of the life. This is wherever we are in the professional role or we are into the personal role, or we are capable to going through this service orientation to serve the family, to serve the organization, to serve the superior of course, and to serve the colleagues, and then to serve the subordinates. So, that service orientation helping others, how we can develop that will be example of the affective commitment. Then attitude surveys, these method of measurement can be the attitude surveys, interviews and the focus groups, and that is also possible. Finally, about it is the results. Results are that is the whenever we are talking about the pay of it is a level 4, because ultimately these are the goals, these are the concern of the organizations, that is they want the results. So, payoffs for the company. So, productivity, quality, cost, repeat customers, and then the satisfaction and the number of accidents. So, therefore, we can measure on basis of this whether the productivity it is increased or not, whether the quality is improved or not, whether the cost is reduced or not, whether there is a repeat customers. So, therefore, once you conducted the training program for one organization and are they asking you to conduct these training programs again and again, then that will be the repeat customers will be there, and then there will be the satisfaction, that is the how the customers are satisfied, whether they are satisfied or not, especially the trainees, and then the number of accidents have been reduced or not. So, the outcome of these particular training programs that can be measured on the basis of the productivity, quality, cost, repeat customers, customer satisfaction and the accidents, that is the whether the reduction of the accidents or not, if the training program is on safety, as I mentioned earlier also. Now, what are the method of measurement? First and foremost is the observation. Like after the training program, do you really find, that is you observe and find out that is yes, in the organization there is a change, there is a change into the interpersonal conflicts, there is a change into the number of accidents, there is improvement in the productivity. So, observations. Performance data. So, when you are talking about the productivity, then definitely the quantity and quality both, whether the quantity and quality that has been improved or it is not improved, and therefore, that will be the performance data from the records or the company databases. Company keeps on generating the databases, and there you can find out whether simple example, another example in the previous module I have given about the employees turnover, and the people are very comfortable while working in the organization, and then that is, and why they are comfortable, because they have learned through training in the organization, that is they have to work together. So, if this is the concept is there, then definitely in that case the ROI, return on investment in the training program on these parameters and on this the evaluation, that will be giving you the right picture. It will help us to understand what type of training programs are to be conducted and what type of the cost is to be incurred in this particular training program. Now, what are the practices? We will see that is the respondents were companies that participated in ASTD benchmarking forum, right, and they, in that case they have come out with this particular data, that is the reaction 91%, cognitive 54%, outcomes are there, that is the percentage of companies using the outcome, right, and then the behaviors, these 23% are using the outcome, and the results the 8% are using, and the 3% are return on investment actual or projected is there. So, this is you will find it is there. Now, we will talk about the determinants determining whether the outcomes are appropriate or not. So, first one is the relevance. Criteria relevance refers to the extent to which training outcomes are related to the learned capabilities emphasized in the training program. So, these outcomes, right, whatever the capabilities have been developed or mentioned or the emphasized during the training program have been reflected after the training program or not, that is the first relevance. Maybe that can be the criteria contamination, refers to the extent that training outcomes measure inappropriate capabilities or is affected by the extraneous conditions are there. So, there will be certain criteria, you will refer those criteria and then you will measure the outcomes and then you will find whether it is an appropriate or inappropriate capabilities are affected. Second is criteria deficiency. Criteria deficiency refers to the failure to measure training outcomes that were emphasized in the training objectives. If there was a particular training objectives and then in that case they are not able to meet those objectives, then we will say there is a criteria deficiency. So, here we will find that is there is a contamination, as I mentioned and explained, that is the criteria contamination, this is refers to the extent, right. So, this particular criteria contamination, this will you will find here, that is this criteria contamination is there, and there is a criteria deficiency. So, this is the criteria deficiency. When we talk about the criteria deficiency and criteria contamination, and we have to connect with the relevance. So, it comes like this, that is there is a contamination, criteria contamination, outcomes measured in the evaluation, deficiency is outcomes identified by needs assessment and included in the training objectives, that what are the need assessments are there at the time of the identifying the training needs and then included in the training objectives, then training program is conducted. So, this is the whatever the objectives that has to be considered, this is the whatever the outcome is there, and here you will find that is the overlapping is there. This overlapping is related to the relevance. What it means? Outcomes related to the training objectives. So, you have to connect the criteria contamination and the criteria deficiency, the objectives and training need identifications, training programs conducted, the outcomes measured, and you are clubbing that, and when they are clubbing and they are having the more. Now, you can have the picture like this also, you can have the picture like this also, more relevance area, what I want to say, less relevance area, more relevance area. So, this bigger will be the your relevance, then definitely you are matching more with the outcomes, whatever the training need identified were there and whatever the training objectives have been framed and the outcomes, they are covering more area of relevance, and that means that is these are the outcomes for the training objectives. Relevance was the first. Now, we will talk about the reliability. Reliability refers to the degree to which outcomes can be measured consistently over a period of time. Now, what should be a time? This can be a question in your mind, and that time can be normally a quarterly. What I suggest is that is the if you plan for the full 1 year, then definitely in that case it will be very difficult to identify the reliability. But if you are going to the quarterly, it will be appropriate time period to identify the reliability. A reliable test includes items for which the meaning or interpretation does not change over time. So, with the period of time, that reliability it does not change, and then you find that yes, when you evaluate in quarterly, you find that is yes, there is a consistency is there. Discrimination. Discrimination refers to the degree to which trainee's performance on the outcome actually reflects two differences in performance. Now, you see that is the one can be a very good in the classroom, but may not be in the field. So, whatever he is learned, like a student can score very high marks in organizational behavior, but outside the classroom his behavior may not be appropriate. That is called a discrimination. So, therefore, in that case it is the learning. Learning is becoming very important, as we talk about that is a permanent change in behavior. So, permanent change in behavior. So, one is that is in the classroom learning, answering the questions, and other is practicing the questions. So, if there is a uniformity, then it is fine, otherwise there will be their discrimination in this particular the reality and performance. What it means is that trainee's performance on the outcome and actually true performance of the trainee. Practicality refers to the ease with which the outcome measures can be collected. So, therefore, I think that this fourth one is very important, that is whenever we are talking about these particular determinants, when the relevance, reliability, discrimination and practicality. Practicality is the most scientific and realistic outcome that refers to the ease with which the outcome measures can be collected. If the outcomes measures can be collected, then that will be the practicality. So, it should not be like a student of the organizational behavior who is the very good scorer in the OBE subject, but outside of the classroom his behavior is not appreciated. So, that should not be there. Here now I will talk about the training program objectives and their implications for the evaluation is there. As I mentioned, this is a learning and this is a transfer. What will be the learning? So, reactions are, did trainees like the program, right? Ratings by peers or managers based on observation of behavior, and therefore, yes, he may say yes, I like the program, but the behavioral skill based will say transfer, that is the okay, learning is fine, that he has learned what the Fiedler's model of leadership talks about, he has learned, but really he is practicing or not, this you can observe only by the ratings by his peers or manager based on their observations of the behavior of this particular person who has been scored very high. Did the environment help learning, right? And now here we have to find out that is the whether the really that environment enabling conditions that have been created or not. If it is created, learning will convert into the transfer, but if the environment is not helping in learning, then it will not be transferred. Was material meaningful? The study material which was provided, whether really that is becoming there useful or not is there. So, in affective, the trainee's motivation or the job attitudes, that becomes very important, that is the whether it is a behavior is skill based, behavior is affective, that the trainee's motivation and job attitude has changed and it has become the positive or not, that is to be seen. The next is the learning the cognitive, the pencil and paper test. So, therefore, the behavioral skill based performance on a work sample learning is there, and therefore, he may do the very nice, as I mentioned, that is a pencil and paper test is there. And another important is that is a transfer, learning to the transfer here, and then in that case it is the performance of the work equipment, is there is a performance on the work equipment or not, that is has to be checked. So, finally, I will talk about, this is my last slide, that is the evaluation design. Whenever we are talking about the evaluation, the training need evaluation, then that we have to understand what factors, what determinants, why it is there is a need for evaluation, how to do the evaluation, and then what are the factors are there which will be determined, that is during training and after the training at the workplace is properly mentioned or it is not as well not been mentioned. So, there will be the threats to the validity, and what will be the threats to the validity, that will lead an evaluator to question the believability of the study results. Now, when you are using the survey method, the most important weakness is the responses by the respondents are true or not. So, this is the believability, whether you will believe those responses or not, because there is a social desire. Are you highly motivated? Right, there will be certain items on motivation. What the person will respond? Person will try a social desire behavior. A respondent will respond in a way that it is having the more socially acceptable. So, I am highly motivated person, and therefore, do you serve the others? What will be the response? Yes, I serve the others. Nobody will say no, I don't serve the others. So, therefore, this is the threats to the validity is in the evaluation, and that is the believability of the study results, or the extent to which the evaluation results are generalizable to other groups of trainees, and what is applicable to the one trainee then not necessarily that will be applicable to the another trainee. So, when we are talking about the reliability and validity, then whether this is reliable or not. I have mentioned about the reliability in the earlier slide, that is the how outcome that has been measured consistently over the time. So, if it is the same results are there, then definitely you can rely, that is the yes, you can give the result, that is the training program that has been become successful with the period of time, that is the same behavior has been shown. But when we are talking about the validity, then in that case we have to also see, that is the whether it is believable or it is not believable, or extent to which the evaluation results with the we cannot generalize with the other groups. So, here I leave the two questions. One question is the understanding the group behavior, group dynamics, and the second one is, that is the design thinking. So, group dynamics and design thinking, these are the two issues whenever we are talking about the evaluation. So, evaluations is the most important part, is that is whatever you content you design, are you able to go for the design thinking. Second is, that is the what is your the group dynamics is there, because whenever you are conducting the training program, it becomes very important. There will be formal or informal groups during the training, and then how to handle the group dynamics, that is also becoming a very important question. And therefore, in the evaluation of training program and with the validity, threats to the validity we will overcome through the as I mentioned in my next module of the group dynamics and the design thinking. So, this is all about the training evaluation, and on basis of this we can evaluate the training program, we can find out whether the learning is really transferred or not. Thank you.